Hi, my name is Carrie Price, and I am a graduate student at Morningside College, and I am completing the course for EDUC 699. The topic of my research is the effects of the Orton-Gillingham approach on elementary students' reading fluency. A little bit about me. I am a graduate student, like I said, at Morningside College. When I am finished here, I will have my Master of Arts in Special Education. I will also have my Special Education Consultant endorsement along with my Strat 2 BDLD endorsement. Currently, I am a Special Education Consultant in grades K through 5 in a school district in Central Iowa in the Midwest. A little bit about my problem. So, not much is known about the short term impacts of reading interventions, and even less is known about those long term effects from reading interventions. MacArthur in 2013 stated that even with standard intelligence and consistent reading intervention and instruction, 5% of children find it problematic to learn how to read. So even if we are giving that instruction and that intense intervention, there are still 5% of our students that just find it problematic to read. And according to the National Center for Education statistics in 2013, approximately 40% of our students in the United States in fourth grade are not fluent readers. A little bit about why I chose this topic. I chose this topic because reading proficiency scores on the fast reading assessment in my school and my entire district are falling below proficiency for many students, especially those students with learning disabilities. There was some growth happening, but not in enough areas, especially the fast scores weren't always representing that growth. So specially designed instruction was taking place, but I just wanted to see if there was a different approach, a multi-sensory approach to teach reading instruction, such as the Orton-Gillingham, that would have an effect on reading achievement on the fast reading assessment. So I dug into some past research, and we know that skills to read and write are acquired in the primary grades. If these skills for the foundation for literacy accomplishments through a child's secondary grades, and if we're not looking at that at the lower primary grades, then they just keep falling further behind, such as not being able to include recognizing letter sounds, decoding and identifying words, and constructing meaning from what is read. So I found some past interventions around reading instruction to see if I could find anything that showed me what worked. So I found a study that used repeated readings, and this was done for a class-wide intervention, and it did not show any improvement of correct words per minute. There they did perform higher than the control group, but it didn't show that correct words per minute, which is what we really want to see. I also found an intervention that was done to see if a resource room was going to provide that uh, reading achievement to go up. So if students are going to a resource room to receive this reading intervention, and oral fluency scores did increase a little bit from 52% to 57%, but that word recognition and comprehension were reported with no growth. And then I looked at some past interventions that use the multisensory approach, especially the Orton-Gillingham approach. And one of these studies did not appear to be effective. So it did not improve, but it rather decreased. So I looked a little bit at the group size, and this group size was an overall class, and it was about 20 minutes a day. And so I wanted to look in to see if I could find some studies that used a different group size and a different time. So then I moved on to the Mustafa and Ghani study in 2016, and students were in this study had mild intellectual disabilities, and it did show that they benefit from receiving a multisensory approach to teach identifying letters and their sounds. So this was a smaller study that was done, a smaller group of students with more time, and the pretest mean score of 2.20 improved to 21.10 for the post-test after these students received that intervention. And so that was a really great intervention to see. The theoretical framework that really goes around my study is the information processing theory. And what this theory says is it just suggests that memory, encoding, and retrieval, they have to be present in order for learning to take place. And one way to increase this memory, encoding, and retrieval is to use multiple senses when learning. When the senses retrieve this information, then the information is recorded into the brain, and then the brain can process and store this information in a behavioral response then can occur. So the multisensory model of Orton-Gillingham does all of these things. It uses sensory and working in short-term memory, long-term memories, and it also uses that repetition and multiple senses to retrieve and store language information. So this theory really goes along with the multisensory approach to teach reading instruction. There is a gap in the research though. So we know that teaching a child to read is crucial in the early years of a child's education, but little research has been provided to really understand what interventions provide the appropriate literacy instruction. Multiple reading interventions have been used, and we know that they've been used for struggling readers in the early elementary years, but it's just still unclear what factors need to be included for each child. Some of these might be the group size, the amount of time in the group, the actual treatment, and the instructional strategies. So identifying struggling readers at a young age, this is also a gap in our research, and we just need to make sure that they're identified at a young age and we're providing those skills to close the gap between those students and their peers. And many times students are not identified until the gap between the student and their peers is too vast. So some of the goals and objectives that I had for my study, the purpose of my study was to determine the effect of a multisensory phonics-based reading instruction on the fast reading assessment scores of students in grades kindergarten through second grade with learning disabilities. The tool that I used was the Orton-Gillingham approach to teach reading, which is also through the IMSE. It is a program that I was able to be trained on. The measurement device that I used was the Fast Reading English Test, and the independent variables were both the Orton-Gillingham phonics instruction and standard reading instruction, because I used the same group of students for two different intervention periods. And then the dependent variable was the fast reading assessment scores. My hypothesis was that students in grades kindergarten through second grade with learning disabilities who receive 30 minutes of daily Orton-Gillingham instruction will score better on fast reading assessment compared to when they receive standard reading instruction. So the importance of research. This research and results from this study are important for special education teachers. Teachers can use and understand the Orton-Gillingham approach to teach reading instruction, and I can use this as an educator to understand how to teach reading to struggling readers and give them strategies to use and strategies not to use. So some of the methods. The participants that were in my study, this was an AB single subject design, so I had the same students, 2 different periods of time. 7 students were in the study in grades kindergarten through second grade. All of these students were low SES qualifying for free and reduced lunch, and there were 6 males and 1 female. All students receiving special education services for reading, and so they were not randomly selected. All of these students did have goals in the area of reading. The materials that I used, like I said, I used the Orton-Gillingham reading instruction materials. So there was a pack that included morphology cards, flashcards with lowercase and uppercase letters, alphabet charts, and there was also clothespins, bicycle dice, roll and read charts, lined writing alphabet paper, number 2 pencils, yellow Sharpie, and pink highlighters. And then I also used the FAST, the Formative Assessment System for Teacher Reading Assessment, found on the FastBridge Learning website at www.fastbridge.org. And on that website, I was able to use the Fast Early Reading English Test for fast reading assessment pages. So I use those pages to give to the students while I use the computer for them to, they use the papers for them to read, and then I use the computer to mark it down. So during this control phase, there were 6 weeks of standard reading instruction. So that reading instruction looked like Students joining in for 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. We used alphabet cards that included both those lowercase and uppercase letters. We used these to identify letter identification. We also used an alphabet clip chart and clothespins, so they had to do some matching. We used a roll and read chart, so they rolled a dice and they read the words or the letters. We also used alphabet writing paper and pencils and a highlighter, so I would take the highlighter and highlight how to write the letter, and then the students would trace that, and then we would gradually move on to where they would be doing it themselves. And this literature also was used to look at the letter sounds, and the alphabet book was provided to each student. So then we went into the intervention phase, and this was 6 weeks of 5 days a week and 30 minutes each day, and that was using the Orton-Gillingham instruction. So 10 to 15 minutes of the 3-part drill and vowel activities. And there was 5 minutes of a review activity with letters in the 3-part drill. So showing students the cards and then them blending them together. And then 10 to 15 minutes was used writing sentences and practicing, and then adding in some of that literature using an alphabet book. So looking at the data, I gave a pretest on September 27th and midpoint assessment October 18th and a post-test on November 8th. And the FAST composite score was collected and examined. So then 2 dependent sample t-tests were used to analyze the group of students before the intervention and then also after the intervention. And data was analyzed when the intervention was complete. So let's look at my results. So my results did not support the hypothesis that I had. The first dependent samples t-test from the midpoint scores showed some statistical difference from the baseline, and the midpoint scores were higher than the pretest scores. So I know that control phase did have some positive impact on the students' reading achievement. So then I took the second t-test when the students were in the intervention phase, and that indicated a statistically significant difference from the midpoint scores. But the post-test scores were only slightly higher than the midpoint scores. So then I was able to look at the Cohen's D score, and I know that the intervention phase was more effective, but it just wasn't effective enough to support my hypothesis. And these are just some of the ways that I was able to look at that and see. So looking at my study, there were some implications. So standard intelligence and consistent reading instruction, like I said, 5% of those students are finding it problematic to learn how to read. So in order to improve these skills of letter sounds, formation, blending, fluency, handwriting, phonics instruction has to be implemented into daily lessons. And students with these mild intellectual disabilities will benefit from this multisensory approach. Well, looking at those implications and moving on to some of those limitations and how future research could change. So there was a small group of participants. Not all these students were selected randomly, and the group of students were ages from 5 to 7 in grades K through 2. So there was no specific grade. And there was no group to compare to, and student scores just were compared during a phase where they received general reading instruction compared to the phase where they received that Orton-Gillingham. So it would be helpful if we were able to compare 2 different groups in one grade. Another limitation and idea for future research would be that this study only included special education students. So if we were able to look at every participant and know that we had a variety of students in the group, not just special education students, this could really help us see if this was effective. And then the length of the intervention period. We want this to be longer than it was. We only had 6 weeks, and this was not enough time to dive in. But if we had 10 to 12 weeks of research for maybe even 45 minutes a day, this could really show a big difference. And then also the assessment used. If we were able to use the early reading English test was just at the kindergarten level. If we could use something that would be beyond that, that could really be helpful. So fast reading assessment scores did increase, and multisensory approaches to teach reading do have a positive impact on reading achievement. It would just be helpful if additional studies, including a larger group of students in an increased period of time, would be beneficial.